Good evening. Welcome to tonight's devotional. We're continuing to look at relationships, especially through the lens of Ephesians chapter 5 and 6. We're looking at the primary relationships each of us have of these mutually submitting relationships. Parents to children, children to parents, wives to husbands, husbands to wives, and masters to slaves, slaves, masters. Now, I mentioned in previous devotionals that probably the best context for us to try to apply this teaching to in our day and age is obviously not masters and slaves, but employees and employers. So there's distinct differentiation between those categories. So I probably need to speak a little bit about that as soon as we get done reading the text. We're in Ephesians chapter 6, and tonight we're looking at verses 5 through 9. So it says, "Slaves, obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. And masters, treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him." So this is one of those things that the Bible comes under target for in today's culture and age, that it doesn't seem to come out and speak against slavery as an evil. And so people want to rewrite the Bible because it does not, well, they want to change slight sections, or they disregard the whole thing because of it. One of the things that we see, and I mentioned it the other night when I was talking about why it shifts from children obey your parents and honor your father and mother, and shifted it to simply fathers don't exasperate your children, was that in that day and age, the fathers were uniquely responsible for the upbringing, the education of their children. And so Paul is speaking to the reality that is, fathers, in this situation that you're in, where you are uniquely responsible, this is how you should raise up your children. And in the same way, Paul is not encouraging slavery, nor is he allowing it or enabling it or permitting it or blessing it. He's speaking to a reality that was. And if you find yourself in this reality, how should a Christian behave? That's what Paul is trying to speak to. It's not saying that we should have slavery. In fact, his letter about Onesimus undermines the very relationship, as we see here as well, that even in this master-slave relationship, if you're a Christian, the key note is one of mutual submission out of reverence for Christ. That is, once again, the umbrella for this entire conversation on relationships. The Chinese sometimes talk about it as bowing to one another. It's this aspect of submitting to each other, because we are to submit to Christ who is over us all. And so children submit to their parents by obeying as a minor and honoring their whole life. Parents submit to their children by seeking after their children's best good, not their own, and by making sure to not frustrate them, but to prepare them for this life in the best way possible. Similarly, now we get to, if you were in Ephesus and you were a slave, how should you be a slave now that you've accepted Jesus Christ as your ultimate master? It says you're supposed to obey your earthly masters with respect and fear and with sincerity of heart, just as you would obey Christ. Now, once again, I want to state that this is the caveat of all these relationships. Wives should not submit to husbands, and husbands should not submit to wives, and children should not submit to parents, and parents should not submit to children. Slaves, masters, masters, slaves, in any way that disregards the primary lordship of Christ. And so that is the caveat. But just as you would obey Christ, obey them not only to win their favor, don't be a brown noser, as the phrase goes. Obey them not only to win their favor when their eye is on you, but as slaves of Christ, doing the will of God from your heart. Serve wholeheartedly, as if you were serving the Lord, not people, because you know that the Lord will reward each one for whatever good they do, whether they are slave or free. Now, I need to speak to this issue that in our context and today, and when you say slavery, you think of American slavery, which was uniquely racial in its makeup. But historically, slavery was an institution of humanity from as far back as history goes. In fact, the very term slavery comes from a European nation, well, European nations named after this whole concept of the Slavs, the Slavic people, because they were so uniquely put into slavery by the early peoples. So you had Egyptians that had slaves. You had Romans that had slaves. In fact, many times Romans would have Greeks as house slaves that were responsible for the upbringing of their children. They would educate their kids because the Greeks were so well educated. In fact, off the Barbary coast of Africa, there were more white slaves sold there than there were black slaves sold to America. And it was not because there was anything specifically humane about it. It was that it was an institution that occurred throughout human existence, and it wasn't historically racially motivated primarily. It was an economic, and it was a nationality, and it was a utilization of power, and I would say that it was primarily of seeking after maintaining an investment. Today's slaves, if you could call them that, which is maybe demeaning historically, which I certainly don't intend, but we have the menial tasks that were done historically by multiple persons are now done by technology. We have dishwashers in our homes and washing machines and dryers, and we have tractors that cultivate fields and all those sorts of things. And so we've been able to rise above, not just morally, but also technologically, this institution of slavery. I would like to say that the Bible undermines the very abusive, coercive nature of the master slave when it does address it. So it says, masters, treat your slaves in the same way. If that doesn't undermine the immoral nature of what we know as slavery, I don't know what would. Treat your slaves in the same way. Do not threaten them, since you know that he who is both their master and yours is in heaven, and there is no favoritism with him. Master, you are not in any way a species above your slave, not in God's eyes, and you will be held accountable and judged for how you treat them. Now, as I said, in today's context, the closest application point for us could in many ways simply be that of employee-employer, because it's of economic superiority. It's that you have this power over another individual for their livelihood. And if we could step back in time historically, the American slavery tends to be a bit of a unique, the American and British slavery tends to be a uniquely hateful, racially charged issue. But if we step back historically to the slavery of the Ephesians, it was primarily an economic reality. And it was a different reality. Let me just leave it at that. And so if you have economic power over another individual, how should you treat them? Well, you should treat them out of reverence for Christ, as the same as you yourself would want to be treated. It's the golden rule applied once again, and I don't mean farcically the one with the gold makes the rules. I mean what Christ said so long ago, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Love your neighbor as yourself, the second greatest commandment after love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, being applied to these imperfect human institutions. Employers, treat your employees as human beings. Treat them as you would want to be treated. If they have a sick kid at home, how would you want to be treated? What latitude would you want to have if you had a sick child at home? If a loved one has passed, how would you want to be treated if your loved one had passed? What freedom would you want to have? If they make a mistake, and it's an honest mistake, what kind of grace would you want extended to you if you made an honest mistake? Now, I'm not saying be lax. I'm not saying turn a blind eye or create a culture in which mediocrity and all sorts of, well, licentiousness in those sorts of economic means would be implied. But I mean, very simply, treat them as a human being. Treat them as somebody who is your equal, whom you happen to have authority over in an economic way. And if you're an employee, how should you be an employee? Well, you should work wholeheartedly as though working for the Lord and not for man. That you should give an honest day's work for an honest day's wage. You should show up a few minutes early. You should work to the best of your ability, and you should seek the betterment and improvement of the company, the individuals, the corporations that you work for. Now, once again, all this is boundaried with the caveat that remains. You should not go against the rule and reign of Christ in any of these relationships. So if you're an employee and your employer is asking you to do something or telling you to do something that goes contrary to God's law, the answer should be no. It should be respectful to a certain degree. You should explain yourself and seek to not do it in a public way that would entrap them into a bad situation. But you should certainly submit to Christ. And everyone else in every other relationship falls under that. So whether you work for somebody else, which all of us in some ways do, or whether other people work for you, you should treat each other as you yourself would want to be treated, with grace and with dignity, with humanity and understanding and compassion. That is how the workforce, the workplace, should be typified. Treating one another as you yourself would want to be treated. May our great God and King bless you and keep you. May he cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. And may you, in whatever situation you are in at work, do your very best as though working for the Lord, knowing that he loves these other individuals as much as he loves you. Thank you, and good night.